Welcome to Killer Women with your host, best-selling author Danielle Girard. And now, Danielle's next killer woman.
Hello and welcome to Killer Women Podcast, a proud member of the Authors on the Air global network with more than 4 million listeners. I am your host, suspense author Danielle Girard, and my guest today is Peggy Townsend. Peggy is an award-winning journalist and author whose work has appeared in Globe magazine, Cruz Noir, and the San Francisco Chronicle, among other publications. An avid outdoors person, Townsend lived for 2 weeks out of her van, hiking the Alaskan wilderness along backroads and coming face to face with a pair of grizzly bears in researching this novel, The Beautiful and the Wild. Welcome, Peggy.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here. And actually, it was 7 weeks in my van, which is a whole different animal living for 7 weeks in a tiny space. So with a husband.
Yes. And you both emerged alive. That's incredible.
Yes, it was.
The grizzly bears might not have been the most dangerous animal on that trip.
I was going to say that. There was a few times where you were wondering, who's going to survive this one?
Exactly. Well, I would have total faith it would be you, Peggy, but I'm glad you both came back. So that's good. Will you tell our listeners a little bit about The Beautiful and the Wild?
Sure. It's a cross between a domestic suspense and a survival kind of thriller. That's about a woman named Liv who gets this cryptic text that indicates that her husband, who she thought was dead, is actually alive. And with kind of nothing left to lose and a whole bunch of her own secrets, she heads north to Alaska with her developmentally delayed 7-year-old son to see if what she thinks is true. And sure enough, she finds her husband there living in a little corner of the wilderness in a small cabin with his own secrets. And the story kind of goes from there in her need to get out of there with her son. And there's all kinds of dangers she faces, grizzly bears, like we talked about, starvation, storms, and another threat, which is her husband's secret, which I won't tell here because it's a spoiler. So
fair, we will not talk about that. But there are so many threats, and her husband. I mean, I think it's not a spoiler to say that he's holding her there. I mean, he's basically saying he wants her to stay, and in particular, he's not going to let her take their son, and he wants to keep his kid, with him. And of course, no mother, included, is going to leave without her child. So that's
That's what drives her to get out of there with her son,
right.
know. And yes, her husband turns into a very cruel man.
Yeah, he does. He's definitely, we'll leave it at that. He's cruel. So tell me, I mean, you talk a little bit about this in the reader's letter, which I love, and I'm not gonna read that, but would you tell us a little bit about the seed for the story? I think it's so interesting.
Sure. The seed for this, there was a couple seeds. One is I'm a journalist, so I was thinking a lot about secrets. So that was kind of the first seed. But the second seed happened when I was in Alaska and we were going fishing. We were hiking into this river to fish for sockeye salmon. And it was late at night in the middle of the summer. So it's like 10:30 at night, but still light. And we come around the corner and across the stream, maybe 25 feet, are a pair of grizzly bears. So, of course, my heart stops. But my son, who was in his 20s then, he had brought a bear gun along, which I didn't know, but he pulls out his gun and in a very calm voice tells us, turn around, walk slowly away, and he stands guard while we leave. And then later he follows behind us. And for me, it was the first time, like I'd spent my whole life keeping him safe and helping him survive.
Right.
And this was the first time he became my protector.
Yeah.
And so I had this thought about how love is such an important part of survival, that in order to survive, we have to have love. And I watched that TV show called Alone. I don't know if you watch it, but they drop
Yeah.
off people in the wilderness
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
And some of them drop out because they're starving, some drop out because they're hurt or get ill, but many of them, I would say most of them, drop out because they miss the people they love.
Yeah.
And so for me, I was just thinking that you have to have love to survive.
Yes, I think that is so true. And Alaska is such an unusual beast, right? It's a place that really attracts, end of the roaders. And I'm curious to know, because this is sort of part, and it depends on everyone's process, but I wonder about this location. Was it, was sort of the thing that called to you the setting of the story, or the story, or you thought of the story and knew that it had to be set there? Because to me, I think especially with Alaska, it could have gone either way.
Yeah, I think I came up with the story first, but then I decided to set it there because, like I said, my husband and I spent 7 weeks in our van in Alaska, and we would end up camping in places where on this beautiful lake where there wasn't a soul around.
Yeah.
And we would see these mountains and we think, oh, we'd love to hike to those mountains or mountain bike to them. And they'd be miles and miles away. So the scale and the beauty is just, you can't even describe it. It's you have nothing to compare it to except if you've been in Alaska. So I thought, when I was thinking about secrets, I thought this is a great place to hide, but it's also the harshness of it. I guess it scrapes away the layers of your protection and really reveals who you are.
Yeah.
And so for me, Liv did that. I mean, she was in this wilderness and it scraped her raw and she found her true self.
Yes. Yeah. And it's very powerful. I think that's exactly right. I think what it took physically and emotionally, right, is the ultimate test for her. And and we're not going to talk about the ending, but very, very satisfying, how she emerges. So, and I don't think, like, having read this book and loved it, it's hard to imagine it set anywhere else, right? It just really, it's I can't imagine. So it's the pairing of the two, in that place and the story are so perfect. So it's wonderful.
Thank you.
So there are actually, at the cabin, and I'm not spoiling anything, I think, by saying this. There are really, there's 6 people. Am I doing that right? 2, 3, 4. Yeah. There's 2 children. And the other boy has a mother named Diana. And then there's a woman who is the husband. Mark has this sort of partnership, romantic relationship with a younger woman named Angela. So there's a whole sort of host of characters. And one of the things I found super interesting was the dynamic between those 3 women, right? There's Liv, who showed up. She did not choose this. Just as wants to find out if her husband is alive and if they have a future together. And then there's Angela, who very much is, she seems to have envisioned this life for herself. She wants to be Mark's partner. They want this sort of open, loving sort of, it feels like a communal living kind of, free love or sort of situation. And then Diana, who is, sort of the quintessential backwoods woman. She's very, strong, and she guides, and so she's in and out a little bit. But one of the things I thought really interesting is that Angela wants very badly to have a baby. She wants to have Mark's baby, and it becomes a sort of currency between the 3 women that two of them have children, right? And Mark is taking them under the ownership of his children. So and yet Angela does not. And it's an interesting way to sort of, for these women to sort of relate, but it makes sense too, right? Talk about that for us, because the dynamic I thought was so interesting. And how did that come to be? And sort of, and were you intentional with the idea that there is something about women that children, the ability to give birth, becomes this sort of power, or I don't even know what exactly to call it, but right?
Yeah. Well, I think, intentionally, as a writer yourself, that sometimes things happen that you don't plan to happen.
Yes.
So this kind of came together organically, but I think historically women have always been valued for whether they can bear children. I mean, you look
Yeah.
at royalty, right? It's like the women are married so they can have an heir, women were prized so if they could have a lot of children and, bring wealth to the family that way. I think that, that's an interesting dynamic. I've actually been watching Lessons in Chemistry, which is set in the 50s.
Yeah.
And it very much brought to mind that idea that women are identified by if they can have children or not,
Right.
because this woman is like, discriminated against because she gets pregnant, right?
Right.
So I think that idea of, modern women facing those old ideas of what a woman was really interesting. I also, I think that bits of that reverberate through today. I mean, I still think if you look around, this whole idea about women giving birth or not, is still reverberates through our culture. And I mean, we've come a long way.
Yeah.
But as I wrote it, I became more and more the realization that was an interesting dynamic.
Yeah.
Among these three women,
and it's the ultimate patriarchy, right? Because Mark is in charge,
right?
And there's only one of him, and and he doles out, with the support really mostly from Angela, who wants to please him and is wants a relationship with him. But it's there's not a lot of room for anybody else's opinion besides Mark's, and that is from coming from a modern world. For Liv, it's a very interesting and difficult thing to get used to in this new environment that she's in. And I think to your point about, valued for having babies, I think even like, women who struggle with infertility, there is this sense that they're somehow worth less, and it becomes so, tied into their self-esteem. And I have lots of friends who struggled, and it's just sort of like it's something they have no control over, and yet it does really impact how they see themselves, how they're seen by society. And in addition to women who choose not to have kids, right? That's another one. So
yeah, it's a very fraught decision, very fraught issue for women that men don't have, I think.
No.
And I think it drives us in a lot of ways. And so, yeah, I wanted to explore that. It was interesting. The other thing that came up is, I interviewed women that were in a polyamorous relationship.
Yeah.
And I read books, and, I read a lot about it. And the interesting thing, it felt to me, now I just don't understand, but there's always that one person being the dominant, and often it was male who manipulated the women around him. And even though these women were amazing and smart, I just couldn't help but think, this person was playing on their insecurities, maybe their weaknesses, their roles. I found it really interesting. And so, while the people that I interviewed and the reading I did, wasn't like my character Mark, there was little bits.
Yeah.
So
I mean, he has that sort of the power of persuasion, and he does, and he pits them against each other in very subtle ways, which, it's interesting how we all sort of naturally seek the approval of whoever feels like they're in charge. And that is interesting too. And that appears in the book. And it's a real power dynamic, even though these three women could absolutely have taken Mark out if they wanted to, right? I mean, they could have just like tied him up, like 9 to 5 style and left him. But no, they, because he gets into their skin and into their psyches. And so let's talk about their childhoods, because I think that's a really sort of natural segue into that conversation, because of course there's all that, even this little t trauma that we come out of our childhood with, right? And so each of these women had difficult and Mark as well, right? Traumatic childhoods, and they serve these characters in different ways. So can you talk about sort of the thought process in that, and sort of, how those came to be to serve those characters?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of ways. One, I'll talk about the one that's not so personal, but I was a newspaper reporter for a long time.
Yeah.
And I did a story about kids that lived on the streets. And so I became well acquainted, wouldn't say friends, but I came well acquainted with them. And there was this little kid named Shorty, and he lived with his mom. They lived in their car, and they got into an argument one day because they had worked, and the mom wanted to take the money that he earned, and he wanted to keep the money. And she opened the door and threw him out of the car and left him. And he was on his own. He was 13 years old. Mm. And so, I hung around Shorty, and I would sit and I would sit while he panhandled. And two things happened. One, the way people walked by and didn't see him at all, he was invisible, just broke my heart. And then the way that he had been so wounded in his life, and yet he was this kind of resilient kid, He figured out a way to live, he would sneak on Greyhound buses to go somewhere to visit somebody he knew. And so that idea of childhood molding us, and that yet how we escape because we have a resiliency, really struck with me. And so these people all are wounded in certain ways, but I wanted to have the resiliency of some of them come through. And especially that was in the little boy, Rudy.
Yes, I love Rudy.
Yeah, I do too. He kind of was reminding me of Shorty. So I think, that idea of rising from the ashes of our childhoods, I thought I wanted to tell that story a little bit too. As a journalist, you have all these experiences that just kind of creep into your fiction writing.
Absolutely. Yeah. You have, and you really can't explore them on an emotional level as a journalist, right? I mean, you can sometimes, but not as often, right? It's more limited, and you get so much more freedom with the fiction. And the other thing that I thought was really interesting is, Rudy, and speaking of Rudy, who also I adore, and anyway, I won't talk about the end, although I also adore that. But is the difference between those two mothers, right? I mean, Liv is, and both boys have, I mean, obviously Rudy isn't developmentally delayed, but he has his own challenges, and the way those two mothers mother is so different, right? And I found that really the sort of the relationship between Rudy and Liv was also very touching, right? Because she saw this need in him for a different type of mothering, I mean, Diana's very hands-off, and at times seems, almost to leave Rudy to the elements. And so, and of course, Liv that is not her style. So that is interesting also in sort of how it informs those two kids and also those moms. So, I wanted to sort of ask about that. Diana has a very blasé relationship with being a mother, and Liv does not. What drove that decision, and how did that happen? Because Diana's style is, it makes us look at her and think, okay, whoa, what is this woman doing, right?
Yeah, and I think Diana has a lot of layers to her as well. But I also, that kind of idea rose out of my journalism career as well, where kids seek love, and there's this little kid that I met in a very poor section of our town, and his mom was a prostitute, and his mom got arrested, and he was hiding out from Child Protective Services and the cops, because as soon as his mom got out of jail, he wanted to go back with her. So his mom was a drug addict. She was, into prostitution. She was kind of a neglectful mom, but he loved her, and his whole goal was to get back to her. His whole goal was to have that love. And sometimes when I was with the homeless kids, that sometimes one would just come and lean up against me just to have a touch, and I think that that's another thing about love, that love drives us in so many ways, and kids seek love wherever they can find it. And some moms are able to give it better than other moms.
Exactly. And I also think it's an interesting, like, if you the only love you know is that kind of love, right? Then that becomes the love that you seek, and that is sort of where things happen, like they've happened to these people whose own relationships with their parents were difficult, and Liv in particular had a very, she had not a very nice mother. And I think it drives sort of what I think we're a pendulum, right? We think we're not going to do the things our mother did to us. So then we do all these other things that are probably equally damaging, but at least they're not the things that our mom did to us. So
Right. Yeah. You hit the nail on the head there.
I think that's exactly true. So, but I think one of the things, sort of, the unexpected, when I was reading the story, I really thought, when I came into it, I thought, okay, this is going to be a story about Mark and Liv and their son. And it really became this, it really was very much about the women and the interactions and the power dynamic and the struggle. And Mark, obviously he created that current, right? He stuck his finger in when he needed something to happen and manipulated it from the outside. But really, those three women did plenty of damage to one another all on their own. And that, I think, was really interesting, because it's very normal. I think in a place like that, you of course want to be top dog, right? Because it ensures your physical safety as well as your emotional safety and your place in the home. So it's really just so powerful and wonderful. I wonder about the way you did this. Are you did you plan it all out? How much of the story do you know before you write it? Is it is that how you usually do it? Tell us about that, your process.
Sure. I'm kind of a combo, I guess. So I usually have the first scene in my head that like pops in, and I see the scene. It's very cinematic. I have it, and I know the ending. For some reason, I know those two.
Yeah.
And then I think, oh my gosh, how am I going to get from there to here?
Yeah.
So then I outline, because, and I do like chapter by chapter, very meticulous outlining, because I don't know what you call this, but I hate the books where you read it and at the end it's like, ta-da.
Yes.
And I think, how did you get there? There was nothing. What I love are the books when you get to the end and you say, oh my gosh, of course.
Yes.
And then you can look back and you see all the clues, the little things that were there that maybe you missed. It's very logical. And so I have to, plan. I have to make that so it happens. I also, I can recommend this to writers, is I hired a development editor to read it.
Yeah.
And, I think writing is creative, but it's also a business.
Yes.
And so you have to invest in your own work. And so I hired this wonderful development editor, and she found a couple of holes in there that I thought I'd planned for. She said, well, what happened? Why not this? And I was like, oh,
right.
Oh,
it's true. I mean, two heads are better than one when it comes to sort of just making sure you have capitalized on every opportunity in a story, because I don't think we can see, I mean, it's sort of like seeing the faults in your own children, right? We're a little blind to them. We're like, oh no, they're perfect. They're totally perfect. So no, I think that is it's a great piece of advice. I think it is and I think doing it once the book is done, is powerful, because you've done the best, you've presented the best you can, and then somebody else can help you sort of elevate it.
Right. I think, I have a wonderful writing workshop group, and they're so supportive as I'm going along, but to have a person that is, they're a professional, they're not there to please you, to make you feel happy. They're there to say, I'm going to make your book the best it can be.
Yes.
And like I said, this was a hole you could have driven a truck through. It was
You're like,
terrible.
It is funny. I mean, I think that's right. You look back and think, oh God, how did I possibly miss that? But again, you're in the weeds with it. So it makes, to me, as a, fellow author, it makes perfect sense that you would have overlooked it. And even your best sort of, your best readers who aren't professionals miss those things. And we're used to reading books just for pleasure. So sometimes we're like, oh, it's great. We don't dig into the nitty gritty the way an actual editor does. And our publishers don't do it the way they used to, right? It isn't, it's their, they have too many books and too many other priorities. So I think for them, it's really beneficial for us to come with the best book we can.
Right. Yeah. I'm kind of obsessive about that. So, I want to turn in the best thing I can and feel really confident about it, and not have to worry that when the book is printed and I look at it and then I realize there's the mistake, right?
Oh God, right. Yeah. No, that's horrible. Don't even say that. Banish that thought. That's terrifying. So tell us, and we're celebrating this, beautiful book, and also this beautiful cover. I don't know if I held it up long enough, but I love that it's the backdrop is the Alaska, and then her, the woman's face. And even that, like, it almost looks like an eye. It's really powerful. They did a wonderful job.
Yeah.
For those people who buy a book by its cover, this one is going to get bought. So tell us what you're working on now. It's like the worst question for an author. You're like, I want to just celebrate for a moment the book I came out, but it's not how it works. And we know you're already at work on something else. So can you tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. I actually just finished it, and just about ready to send it off to my editor. So this is another story that's set in the wilderness, but it's set in Oregon, and it's about a female hermit who meets a runaway young girl in the woods, and they're both being hunted, and they're both running from something towards something. And so it's a lot about their relationship. It's a lot about being in nature, in the woods.
Yeah. Yeah. And you do that. Sorry, go ahead.
I say it's another kind of survival thriller. So.
Well, you do that so well. And there's the survival, there's the physical elements of survival. And there are, like you said, there's some storms, and there's concerns about food and about water. And but in addition, you weave it so beautifully into sort of the emotional survival, which is what I like, because it's fun to read about survival, like the shows like Alone, but to read sort of how that impacts us emotionally and creates, sort of extra anxiety and concern, and it's so powerful. And then how we emerge, if we can emerge, how we emerge. And that is beautiful. And the ending, it's really, really, really lovely. I was so pleased. So it's not it's not without its sacrifices and complications, but it's beautifully done. And anyway, I loved it. And you heard that one of my favorite quotes is in here. I read it on my, if you didn't listen to it, you didn't hear it, it's on my quote of the week on a Monday. Here, you can find it on my social media. But Peggy, congratulations on an incredible book, and I hope it sells 1 million copies.
Oh, thank you. I do too, and I so appreciate talking with you and you reaching out to talk to me about my book. Yeah, it's an amazing process to produce a book. So thank you for celebrating that with me.
Absolutely. And I thank you to Lauren Jaggers, who's your publicist, who's always sends me the best books. He's like, you got to read this one. I am so grateful to him. He provides, a lot of my best, most favorite books. So he's brilliant as well. And that's at Berkeley. Everybody, this has been Killer Women with Peggy Townsend. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you next time.